evening, everybody. Very many thanks for the kind invitation to talk tonight, and I hope that I can share with you my passion for the history of and capabilities of ambulance trains. Some of you already know of my involvement with ambulance trains was during the last 15 years of the Cold War. Much of what was done during the Cold War was shrouded in secrecy, and many people had no idea that the British Army still had an ambulance train capability right up until 1995. We were the custodians of a very long heritage and tradition of service on hospital trains and ambulance trains that goes right back to the South African War. And my presentation tonight will outline that history. In most people's minds, railways in the military context are associated with the movement of armour and ammunition, and back in the First World War with many hundreds of tons of forage for horses. But they did that very well. But throughout the existence of railways, ambulance trains have been another success story. Sadly, very few people have any real understanding of the role and capabilities of rail, either in history or ongoing today. Right from the outset, can I impress upon you the importance of railway in modern warfare? It's well worth remembering that during World War I, most sick and wounded would have spent some time on an ambulance train during their journey back home to England. Between 1914 and 18, 5 million sick and wounded were carried on British Army ambulance trains in France. Clearly, I'll come back to World War I in due course, as I'll be looking at things chronologically. A quotation from a paper in 2002 reminds us of the loss of corporate memory between wars. This was very much the case with ambulance trains. The capability was disbanded after World War I, drastically reduced after World War II, and completely disbanded after the Cold War. Here we are in 2025, and I predict Europe will very much need ambulance trains once again. Rail is a well-proven method of transporting large numbers of sick and wounded. Ambulance trains don't move anybody anywhere fast, but they will move large numbers in warmth, light, relative comfort, and receiving medical and nursing care. But ambulance trains rarely rate more than a few lines in histories of various campaigns, so I want to look at that history. The earliest record of the use of rail to move sick and wounded in battle, after battle, was in 1855 in the Crimean War, when wounded were simply laid on straw in open wagons that had been used to build the railway at Balaclava. Trains were subsequently used in a number of wars, notably in America, when in 1864, after the Battle of Gettysburg, more than 15,000 wounded were moved by rail. In Europe, rail came to the fore in the Franco-Prussian War of 1870 to 71. When early four-wheeled rail rolling stock was specially converted to carry sick and wounded. Let's move on to 1877, and the earliest patient-carrying tramway in the UK was at the Royal Naval Hospital in Haslar, in Hampshire. This was a 400-yard straight standard gauge tramway used to move patients who had been landed at Haslar Jetty from ships at anchor in Spithead to the main hospital building. Oh, sorry, wrong. These were two hand-propelled, purpose-built ambulance tramcars, and I use these two photographs with the permission of the Haslar Heritage Group, and they show casualties from a fire in Gunworth Quays having been brought across Portsmouth Harbour to Haslar Jetty and then into the Royal Naval Hospital. I'd like to move on to 1897 to another patient-carrying tramway, albeit civilian, but it was of considerable importance. I don't know how many of you have heard the phrase that one went down the river with fever. This referred to patients who were taken by boat from central London out to the 3 smallpox hulks anchored in the River Thames at Dartford, a fascinating story in their own right. When the hulks were decommissioned, the Joyce Green Hospital, built on Dartford Marshes, became a major infectious diseases referral hospital. In 1897, a horse-drawn fleet of tram ambulances was built in order to transfer patients from boats at the Longreach Pier to the Joyce Green Hospital complex. These continued until 1938, with the horses being replaced by motor towing vehicles in 1925. Let us now move to the South African War, 1899-1902, where hospital trains, as they were originally called, came to their own. The South African War saw a specifically constructed hospital train. This was a 7-coach train, carried just 74 stretchers, and was called the Princess Christian Hospital Train after Queen Victoria's third daughter, Elena, who became Princess Christian of Schleswig-Holstein by marriage. The train was built by the Birmingham Carriage and Wagon Company, in effect flat-packed and shipped out to Durban in South Africa, where it was reassembled. It was a very lavishly appointed train. Ward accommodation, even a separate dedicated officers' dining room. The Princess Christian train was part of the force that relieved Ladysmith, and it's seen here crossing the Tiliga River at Colenso on the 19th of March 1900, en route to Ladysmith. I have another parallel interest in the postal history in relation to hospital and ambulance trains. This is a very rare piece of postal history, an envelope posted on the 14th of September 1900, somewhere in South Africa, and it carries a very faint 2-line hand stamp of the Princess Christian Hospital train. Shown in the picture on the right from an article in a magazine called The Ladies' Realm of 1900, shows a Nurse Crichton from the Army Nursing Reserve, who it is said travelled out to Africa with the train. As the envelope is addressed to Mrs. Crichton in Surrey, we have here the envelope from a letter home to Mum. Through the delights of eBay, I found this original photograph of the Princess Christian train, dated in manuscript on the back 1901, and this was after the train had been painted white. Records show that during the conflict, the Princess Christian train carried 7,548 wounded soldiers and travelled over 42,000 miles around South Africa, a real testament to the value of rail. Not all the trains in South Africa was luxurious. This is the number 4 train, set the precedent for trains being converted from locally available rolling stock, somewhat more Spartan, but nonetheless functional. It's interesting to see that this train was commemorated on a 1989 stamp from a country with no railways. The wounded from the South African War came back to Great Britain by sea, and this original photograph shows an unidentified ambulance train alongside the SS Lismore Castle at an unknown port, although it's probably Durban. The Royal Victoria Hospital in Netley in Southampton, I'm sure familiar to some of you, played a major role in caring for the returning casualties from South Africa. And this photograph shows the hospital station in 1902. The only trains to run on this hospital branch were ambulance trains from Southampton docks. The rolling stock in this photograph is the War Department ambulance train that consisted of stock that was more commonly simply referred to as Netley coaches, of which there were 5. The next major conflict in the 20th century that made extensive use of rail because of its long lines of communications was the Russo-Japanese War, 1904-5. Clearly, we weren't involved, but it was a major development in the use of rail, with 78 different hospital trains in use. The Trans-Siberian Railway was a major factor in the war, but there were 2 major shortfalls. At that time, it was approximately 1,000 miles short of its intended destination of Vladivostok. In addition, much of it was single track, which posed considerable issues for the troop supplies and ammunition that need to travel east, and the sick and wounded who needed to travel west. The photograph is of an original staff of a Russo-Japanese War hospital train. And there's also an indication of the casualty statistics, although the numbers varied very widely depending on the source one reads. This is a very striking photograph taken at St. Nicholas Station in St. Petersburg in 1904. It shows the military hospital train of Maria Fyodorovna, named after the patronage of the Dowager Empress, the mother of Tsar Nicholas II. I think any of our nursing colleagues, I think, just have to think about how you would function dressed like that. Most of the early efforts at rolling stock conversion in Europe were based on the use of goods wagons, slinging stretchers from the roof or supporting them on various types of trestles. This was the Zavododsky method, invented by a Russian in 1873 and used by the British to carry 8 stretchers per goods wagon. This system could still be found described with all its associated drills in the Royal Army Medical Corps Training Manual of 1908. The use of the term hospital train was subsequently altered by the British to ambulance train. In the early months of the First World War, French rolling stock of all types was taken over by the British, and the first 11 trains supporting the British Expeditionary Force were all French rolling stock. This is the staff of number 7 ambulance train in front of a French freight wagon. These early trains in France used this BDA frame system, as it was called, that folded flat for storage, but when opened held 3 stretchers. I don't know whether one of these has actually survived in any dusty vault of a museum somewhere, but I'm sure an engineer could easily manufacture a replica. Here is an official army form W3329, and it was a postcard given to returning troops to send to their families, stating which hospital they had arrived at. This card carries the hand stamp of number 7 ambulance train of the Expeditionary Force, and the writer states he's at number 3 Southern General Hospital in Oxford. This card illustrates one of the major difficulties trying to research the history of our ambulance trains. The same numbers, sadly, were allocated to both home and overseas ambulance trains, and hence the confusion. This card was usually given to troops on their return, yet the hand stamp carries Expeditionary Force, implying it was overseas. Here's a Christmas card carrying the hand stamp of number 8 ambulance train. Again, we have the same issue. The hand stamp reads number 8 ambulance train Expeditionary Force, Dover. But I have the envelope in which this was delivered, and it definitely originated in France. Here's another Princess Christian train, this time in the First World War. Again, built in Birmingham, shipped out to France in April 1915 as the number 15 ambulance train, but it did carry the Princess Christian name on its side. This is a very iconic and much published photograph. 2 other trains were sponsored during the First World War and converted again over here and shipped to France. The number 16 and number 17 trains were sponsored by the UK Flour Millers Association, and the trains carried door plates about this sponsorship, of which only single figures still survive, and this particular one is in my collection. This is an example of the ever-popular, highly collectible embroidered silk postcards sent back by troops during the First World War. Again, a study in their own right. The writer of this card was an RAMC soldier, addressed to his mother, and it's clearly date line number 17 ambulance train, BEF, France. But the other interesting thing about number 17 was it was handed over from the RAMC and staffed by the Friends Ambulance Unit of the Society of Quakers, as shown here in a group photograph on deployment. These were all conscientious objectors, and in the course of the war, the Friends Ambulance Unit ran 4 trains and actually 2 ships as well, and were very much part of a superb organisation. From late 1914, considerable amounts of rolling stock was shipped out to France. This is part of the number 24 train on the SS Africa at Tilbury Docks. It's an interesting fact and a testament to both the railway and the dock workers that out of some 800 railway carriages shipped to France, only 3 were in an unserviceable state when they arrived. During the First War, British railway workshops also converted trains for use by the American Army when they entered the war. This was the number 60 US ambulance train, converted from London and Yorkshire Railway rolling stock, seen on a train ferry on the 11th of April, 1918. I'd like to tell you a little bit about one of these trains, number 55 US ambulance train. Its staff were assembled and designated number 32 hospital train at Fort Sheridan in Illinois in January 1918. The Americans still used and continued throughout the war to use the term hospital train. That staff sailed from New Jersey to Brest in France, but there they found British rolling stock, ready converted for them, shipped out from England, but labelled number 55 ambulance train. So the American unit number 32 hospital train changed its title and operated as number 55 US ambulance train. Another source of confusion for researchers. The map on this slide shows the 10 journeys of this train in its final month of operation, December 1918. Of interest, the train undertook 2 trips to Geneva in Switzerland and repatriated over 300 American prisoners of war per trip. It's often forgotten that although neutral, Switzerland accepted over 68,000 wounded British, French, German, and American POWs during the course of the war. And they, of course, then all had to be repatriated at the end. And this was not the only train that was involved in that operation. Narrow gauge trench railways also featured in the First World War, operated by horse, man, and motive power. They proliferated as a means of moving, obviously, stores as well as casualties. They were particularly in the British and the Canadian sectors. And it wasn't only on the Western Front that British ambulance trains could be found. Here are photographs of ambulance trains standing in the desert of Palestine, Alexandria docks in Egypt. Note these ones have the red crescent on rather than the red cross. And the number 40 ambulance train having been shipped out from England in the Sinai Desert. I'd like to illustrate for you the chain of casualty evacuation from the Western Front in Europe, what I term the route to Blighty. As I mentioned right at the beginning, a wounded serviceman could almost certainly spend some part of his journey home on an ambulance train. So in the top right, you've got the trench tramways, various ways servicemen got to care. From the casualty clearing stations, they were moved in ambulance trains, such as the top left, back to the base hospitals and to the channel ports. They were then put in hospital ships, of which there were many, various, usually Royal Mail postal steamers and that sort of thing, taken up from trade, across the channel, inevitably back in ambulance trains again. And the left-hand bottom picture shows patients being unloaded at Leicester. And then they were distributed around hospitals in the UK. Here's another army form, the W3118. This was a parchment envelope that contained field medical documents and was the forerunner of the FMed 25, 26, 27 that I've no doubt some in the audience may be familiar with. It recorded the various evacuation units through which the patient passed on their way home. And if you look at the bottom left, you see that he was on number 28 ambulance train on the 16th of October, 1917. Records show that number 28 was again converted in England, shipped out to France sometime in 1916. By now, they were very standard trains that were being sent out consisting of 16 coaches, 950 feet long, and weighing some 450 tons. The reverse, the right-hand side of this AFW 3118, shows the patient was a Captain Wood, who had sustained a gunshot wound of his right thigh. At the bottom, it shows that on the 17th of October 1917, he was transferred to His Majesty's hospital ship, Carisbrooke Castle, for the trip back across the Channel. Carisbrooke Castle was a Union Castle Royal Mail steamer built in Glasgow, converted to a hospital ship, and served between the 3rd of September 14 to the 26th of August 1919. Her home port was Southampton, and she carried 439 casualties per trip. Records show that in the month of October 1917, she did 8 crossings to Southampton, carrying 4,590 casualties, of whom Captain Wood would have been one. Sadly, it's not recorded, but he would undoubtedly have been put on another train for his journey to a hospital somewhere in Great Britain. Not many people know that amongst the home ambulance trains, there were 5 trains staffed and operated by the Royal Navy. The major difference between the Royal Navy and all the other home ambulance trains was that the patients travelled from the ships in the cot on which they remained throughout their journey, and it was slung from the roof of the carriages like a hammock. Here is a postcard written from the number 5 Royal Navy ambulance train. It's interesting that the writer states, writing from Hull, bound for Chatham, calling at Truro. I think we would all raise an eyebrow at that routing until one realises that the major Royal Naval Convalescent Hospital was actually in Truro. Here's a picture postcard of Gillingham in Kent, carrying the hand stamp of an ambulance train comfort fund. These were people who collected funds and comforts and gave returning servicemen postcards they could send home. And this one was just that. I've arrived here quite safely. My leg feels not so bad. I only wish I could have got further north, right soon, Kitchener Hospital, Block 2, Ward 9, Brighton, England. And there were any number of these comfort funds around the country for all, not just for ambulance trains, but for all service people. Before leaving World War I, I'd like to remind you of that important statistic mentioned earlier, that in France between 1914 and 18, over 5 million sick and wounded were carried on British ambulance trains alone. But remember, across the protagonists, there were also French, German, Prussian, Austrian, Hungarian, Italian, and Russian hospital and ambulance trains, thus reaffirming the major role and contribution that rail played throughout Europe. More of that must wait for another day. Moving on then to the Second World War. Remember, we'd got rid of all our capability after the First World War, and at the start of the Second World War, 32 trains were produced for the British Army, along with 34 casualty evacuation trains that were designed to deal with the casualties from wide-scale bombing of British cities. They were in fact never used in that role, but some played a part in the evacuation of London hospitals. The earliest conversions, made in 1939, were these Siphon G Great Western Railway milk vans, very Spartan, although functional. Here are 2 original photographs of the number 34 casualty evacuation train, stabled at Sevenoaks in Kent, along with a photograph of its staff. These were Ministry of Health trains, not War Department. And the staff came from the Red Cross and the voluntary sector. This photograph shows a group of casualty evacuation trains stabled at Streatham Station in 1940. Note they did not carry Red Cross emblems. The right-hand photograph shows Her Majesty the Queen visiting one of those casualty evacuation trains. Initially, 12 home and 13 overseas ambulance trains were commissioned, but 9 were to be lost in France at the time of Dunkirk. Not many people realise that 9 full-size trains went across with the British Expeditionary Force. Here is a coach that was in the formation of one of those trains lost at Dunkirk. It was subsequently used by the Germans, eventually recaptured after D-Day, and served out its military days on the Longmoor Military Railway. It still exists, last heard of in Derbyshire, but in serious need of some TLC. As the Second War progressed, facilities and standards of conversions improved, such as here the 63 home ambulance train. Netley Hospital and its station again came into use in the Second World War. Here is the number 65 ambulance train, and you can see the numbers very clearly at the end of the front carriage so that anyone would recognise what the train was when it arrived. Here is it waiting to proceed into the hospital branch, and the photographs below show the same train being unloaded at the hospital station. You may notice on the bottom figure there are letters on the side of the coaches, an A and an H, and each coach, the function of that coach, be it a ward, be it admin, be it staff accommodation, was identified by that code letter, and that was standardised across the entire ambulance train fleet. Just as in World War I, 34 ambulance trains were produced for use by the American Army, and this one was converted from Great Western rolling stock, here at its press launch in 1943, undoubtedly at Swindon. I want to mention one specific train, number 45 overseas ambulance train, operated in Belgium and Holland before going into Germany. I have some personal testimony from a veteran who served on this train, and I'd like to quote some of what he said. After a few weeks, we were told we were moving up to a little station near Belsen concentration camp. None of us knew what to expect before we took the patients on board. They were just bags of bones and expressionless faces in striped suits that looked like pajamas, the victims of man's inhumanity to man. I've been able to find a very historic photograph. It's an RAF reconnaissance photo taken by 541 Squadron RAF on the 17th of September 1945. I don't know whether this is number 45, but you can see right diagonally right across the photograph a 10-coach Allied ambulance train with its red crosses very visible on its roof, standing at the Bergen-Belsen station. 48 years later, in 1993, we operated one of our trains into that very same site, now somewhat modernised and named Bergen-Hohne. The significance of where we were, I can assure you, was not lost on my staff. Immediately post Second World War, the British Army continued to use ambulance trains to move sick and injured throughout the corridor of occupied Europe back to the UK. This is a most unusual piece of rolling stock about which there are very few records, and it was British Army Railcar number 1. It was an 8-coach Belgian State Railway railcar converted in 1945 to take 27 stretchers and acted as a feeder service from the environs of Brussels back to join British Army Ambulance Train number 1 that ran the length of the British zone. After the decommissioning of many of the ambulance trains used in the Second World War, this one British Army ambulance train was built between September and December 46 by 2 German railway workshops. It was a 16-coach train, carried some 250 patients. The train was routed through the British zone from Osnabrück via Wuppertal, Münster, and Hanover to Hamburg. Here the patients were transferred to the hospital ship El Nil that undertook regular crossings back home. This train was to run through the British corridor of BAR until air trooping and air evacuation took over the task. May I take you away from BAR just for a few moments so as to place the Korean War of 1950 to 53 in its chronological place. You will tell me my title was British Army Ambulance Trains, but I do need to mention Korea. There were trains shipped out from America and operated by the United States on behalf of the United Nations. So what were we doing there? British involvement was in Japan, where RAMC and QA nurses staffed individual ambulance train coaches that were attached to scheduled trains. They ran to and from the United Nations Air Base at Iwakuni and the British Commonwealth General Hospital at Kure. There is very little information surviving on these coaches, and this is the only photograph I know of that shows part of the 16-bed conversion. And so to the Cold War. And what was actually the second British Army of the Rhine. This stylized map of BAR will be familiar to some of you, I'm sure, and shows the first British Corps area of responsibility, where we faced Russian and East German forces throughout the Cold War. Each NATO country had its own area of operation, with West German and the Netherlands Corps to the north, and the south we had Belgium, West German and American troops. Into the Cold War, both the British and the German armies maintained a small amount of ambulance train rolling stock in Europe in preparation for any future conflict. In the case of both armies, they were manned by their respective reserve armies. This is the German army's, the Bundeswehr, one of their ambulance trains. They were conversions of revenue-earning rolling stock, so very rarely released for exercise purposes, and photographs are extremely rare. Turning to the British Army organisation. Prior to 1985, there were several individual train staffs. From 1985, 10 ambulance trains were formally constituted into the Ambulance Train Squadron RAMC that it was my privilege to command from 1985 to 1994. At that point, cuts under options for change and the strategic defence views for the TA reduced the number of trains to 4 and reformed as an ambulance train group, RAMCV. One of our squadron plaques shown here was on eBay recently, and it was described as rare. It was indeed. We only produced less than 50, as far as I recall. After the fall of the Berlin Wall, the collapse of the Soviet Union, along with the drawdown of British Army of the Rhine, the ambulance trains were all eventually scrapped, and in April 1995, the staff are all subsumed into a newly formed 335 Medical Regiment. Sadly, the British Army has now given up all its ambulance train capability, along with all its wider railway trades. One piece of history that I got in a letter today was that the last QA nurse who served with me in the squadron finally retired from the British Army today. And so the personal, the corporate memory of operating trains has finally come to an end. May I remind you of the casualty evacuation concept from BAR in the Cold War? Again, I don't expect you to look at the detail, but we would have run 2 types of trains, one for the short haul loop of field hospital to the forward combat zone to the general hospitals in the rear combat zone. And a long haul train would have run back to the Channel port, and then obviously the patients would have been transferred to ships. Let us now look at the rolling stock and what we did during the Cold War. In the time I was involved, I operated 3 generations of rolling stock. This first one, designated BYMK, which is its operating code, was ex-American reparation stock built in 1952 and designed for those longer journeys where patients were transferred onto bunks. We then had a fleet of 12 1957 XDB BYG stock, again converted to take stretchers, but the patients stayed on their stretcher on frames in the coaches. Here's a picture of the stock in use in the early 1980s. In 1990, the squadron started taking delivery of replacement rolling stock with the rolling stock designation of BCYL LAS, the LAS standing for Lazaretszug, the German for hospital train. These were actually older vehicles from 1954. They were purchased direct from the Deutsches Bahn, converted in British Army workshops to take 40 stretchers per train. They were actually superb conversions. They still had 25 years life in them when they were scrapped, and undoubtedly could still be in use today. The British Army had 3 kitchen diners, and although they were not allocated to my trains on mobilisation, we used them in our train formations on exercise, and I'm pleased to report that this kitchen diner is now preserved on a German heritage railway. Our trains needed baggage wagons, and these were hired in from the DB and earmarked in transition to war. Each exercise, we tended to get a different one. This one was from the DB Intercity Fleet, and they were used for our command post and stores. The British Army only owned the ward coaches, so we also hired in DB couchette cars for sitting casualties and for our staff accommodation. A word about locomotives. All British Army locomotives worked all the depots in BAOR. They would also shunt our ambulance train formations as necessary and deliver us to exchange sidings for collection by the Deutsches Bahn. So there we have all the elements of our trains. And here is one of the 10 trains that I was responsible for, standing in the Arsbeck trainee area. This train is 3 coaches short of a full-size operational train, but we had a very standard configuration that separated the train into 3 functional blocks: the ward, the admin, and the sitting blocks. Let me show you that graphically. 7 ward coaches, command post and stores, kitchen diner, staff accommodation, sitting patients, giving us a casualty lift of 280 stretchers and 216 sitting patients, all staffed by a staff of 50 all ranks. So we now need a locomotive. Throughout my time, we were usually pulled by DB Class 219 locomotives. This locomotive is of importance because our early BYMK stock was steam heated, and this was the last class of DB locomotives capable of generating steam for heating. We now are ready to move, and I want to show you the only piece of video of us moving at speed that I know exists. "28 seconds of history." And let me just show you a little bit more about how we operated. Patients arrived at the railheads in road coaches that had been converted to take stretchers. These were all the coaches in BAOR used to take children to school and that sort of thing. And they all had a war roll of conversion to ambulance coaches. Triage within the road coach was undertaken by one of our nursing officers. And what they were doing was allocating the patient to their position in the train, be it top, middle, or bottom, depending on the level of nursing care that they needed. Loading an ambulance train was labour intensive, and all operational planning was for ground level loading. We never assumed we would ever have a platform. So this, of course, needed a degree of skill and training to do. And you'll see the process: 1 team of people outside unload the coach. and another team inside waiting to receive it. That looks very slow and very methodical, which it actually needed to be, but we could, from the moment someone was offloaded to being secured in their place in the train, we could do at a rate of 1 stretcher per minute. 11 staff, but labour intensive, but we could do it. And then, of course, you had the inside people and the scraped knuckles that went with it. And I want to show you one last clip of video to give you a flavour for the clinical side, and also to challenge you to think about doing things travelling at 120 kph on the mainline rail system. Our rolling stock was rated to go at 120, so we had to be able to work at 120. And you see there the top bunk is slightly out of reach, so you don't put somebody up there who's going to need a lot of care. What you'll see is one of the staff talking to a patient on the top bunk, and to get there, she has to step on the bunk below, sadly. But you'll start to see the line side movement, and the speed of the train should be apparent from the pictures. Okay. And then we just show you a very simple piece of clinical care, and an illustration that you have to have your train legs to do anything practical. Then the next snippet is showing our stores. Although each ward coach had a supply of its own to start with, individual items as required would be collected from the stores wagon by the staff as they were needed. I'm going to stop there and move on as time is slightly against me. But as you can see, that's what we did for some years in BAOR. During the Cold War, there was a well-defined plan for the return of casualties to the UK in the event of hostilities. This plan was known as Joint Theatre Plan 201 and would utilise BAOR ambulance trains, cross-channel ferries, ambulance trains in the UK to distribute casualties, just as was done in both previous wars. There was, however, no dedicated ambulance rolling stock within the UK at that time, and reliance was placed on the transition to war period being of sufficient length to allow conversion of rolling stock. I only hope they think about that in the future. Although the number of trains required had been scoped in detail, conversion plans were far from firm. In October 1982, I was involved in a project to validate a prototype conversion designed by British Rail for an FO Mark II intercity coach, and as you can see there in the lower photograph. But it had been long known that you couldn't put a stretcher through the door of a railway carriage, so you needed, in this case, an NLX newspaper sorting van to allow the double door access that was necessary to unload the stretchers. The stretcher would then be carried the length of the train to the appropriate berth. The doors were narrow, and the pole you can see on the right-hand side had no structural significance and would have been removed at the time of conversion. May I show you another very unusual exercise I was involved in as the subject matter expert? Exercise Pilot in 1998 in London was an exercise as part of the planning and research at the time for the distribution of casualties from a disaster at Heathrow Airport. It was before the M25 was completed, and one possible option was to use the London Underground. The exercise took place using a 6-coach formation of the Piccadilly line rolling stock. The train ran round the Piccadilly Loop and back to Kensington Olympia. Some of you will be very familiar that Kensington Olympia is in fact ground level and road level is at platform level, so that patients easily moved to the fleet of waiting ambulances for movement out to hospitals in North and Outer London. Concept worked, but it was never enshrined in emergency plans. So let me just move abroad and tell you some things that are happening today. Some 30 years ago now, I was involved in some of the design work for the Lifeline Express, a hospital train in India. This train was pioneering in taking medical care to remote parts of India, utilising 85,000 kilometres of track of the Indian rail network. This train had 2 operating theatres, performed orthopaedic procedures for old polio, along with cataract and plastic surgery. It's now in its 3rd generation of rolling stock, with over 900,000 people having been helped by this train. In 1994, a major funding from the pharmaceutical industry created this South African train called Fila Fipa, which meant good, clean health in one of the local languages. They didn't provide surgery, but a range of clinics and diagnostic care. Impact India, the charity behind the Lifeline Express, took its expertise to Hong Kong in 1996 and developed the Lifeline Express in China. More commonly known as the I train, this train primarily performs cataract surgery and has performed over 100,000 procedures since it started. There are also several trains in remote areas of Siberia. Of interest, this one even has a chapel car and its own priest who travels with the train. As COVID-19 got hold, France was to rediscover the value of rail and move patients around the country to available intensive care facilities. The orange line on the map in the right-hand corner shows rail moves, and the green were air and the red was road. The top photograph is Strasbourg Station on the 26th of March, 2020. I was very pleased to see when MSF started using rail in Ukraine, first of all with ad hoc rolling stock, but there's enormous scope for rail, and they now have a properly converted ambulance train for use, and I'm very grateful for MSF for having allowed me the photographs I can use. In just 3 weeks, they created a train that addressed all the problems of providing care up to HTU and ITU conditions. Because one of the keys now, if I tell you on my trains in BAR all those years ago, we had 1 cylinder of oxygen per carriage. And we knew we wouldn't get any resupply because the RAF wouldn't fly it because it was a hazardous air cargo. This train now has an entire coach of oxygen concentrators. And there is no doubt that that is one of the major challenges that has to be faced when looking at modern ambulance train operating. And so to my last slide, what of the future? When our ambulance train capability was disbanded in 1985, a senior Army Medical Services officer said to me, "Brian, we will never need trains again." I believe he may be proved wrong, because I fear, as has been shown by MSF, there is going to be a need in Europe in our lifetime. But the military, and indeed the civilians, need to rethink the capability. I believe that both the British Army and its NATO allies will need ambulance trains again. But who will operate them? The corporate memory's been lost. All the expertise has gone. I think, as I mentioned, the last person retired from the British Army today who served with me delivering medicine on rails. May I give you my personal thought? And that any new generation of trains should be modular, should be equipped to live minimum of 5 days continuous operating. They need to be locomotive hauled, channel tunnel compliant, so they can go anywhere. I believe that if you just think of Birmingham to Vilnius, real possibility, but we need to be designing and building prototype stock now and not waiting till somebody picks up the phone and says, can we have an ambulance train tomorrow? We can easily produce the traditional ambulance train for lying and sitting patients with in-transit sustaining nursing care. However, we need to think outside the box and create a retrieval capability on rail with advanced resuscitation, HDU and ITU capability. Dare I say it, a hospital train. It can be done, but it needs political, military, medical, and an accompanying checkbook so that it can be done properly. I am still waiting for my phone to ring, but I fear with the ageism in both government and the military, it never will. Thank you for listening, and I should be happy to try and answer any questions.
Brilliant. I want to slow clap a little bit for that. Thank you so much. Well, there's lots of claps coming down at the bottom, so they're doing it for me. Brilliant. Oh, just absolutely fascinating, Brian. Thank you so much. I said I was a history nerd, and that was just utterly fascinating. So thank you so much for sharing your expertise and the history, indeed, and an important history, as I've emphasised several times on our socials this week about why this is such an important talk. I've absolutely lost my questions there. There we go, they're back. Okie doke. So I'm just going to pop on to the next screen for everyone. Just to highlight our next webinar. And of course, whilst I'm doing this, please do get your questions in. Jean, lovely to see that you've asked one there. So not to end on a very sad note as well, but the next webinar that's taking place on Thursday, July the 10th, at 8 o'clock is HEMS Dispatch, What Does Good Look Like? Again, this is going to be another really good insight sort of into the workings of trauma care, sort of the behind the scenes look, as we all have done tonight with ambulance trains. It's really important to get a full picture when it comes to trauma, to get a full insight into everything that we do. And Liam Webb, who I think has spoken at a conference before, will be joining us for that. Now, it doesn't feel the appropriate time to announce, but I am going to announce because I've got a lot of regulars on here tonight who names I recognise and people that I've become good friends with over the years. So I suppose please do join me on July the 10th because it's going to be my last ever webinar as it stands at this moment in time. I am unfortunately leaving trauma care for pastures new come the middle of July, as I've landed a bit of a dream role. I'm not going to go into too much detail, and it's a huge step up in the world. But so please do come along just to say goodbye, if anything, but also to listen to the wonderful Liam, because he's got some fantastic things to say, and I've had another sneak peek of his webinar as well, and it's a brilliant talk. And again, really important to know sort of on the dispatch side, sort of how you can work coherently with each other. So yes. Let's move on. Hopefully people have scanned the QR code and they will be joining us in 2 weeks' time. The Q&A section. So another QR code for you all, because we love QR codes and they're really handy. Let me just grab that chat up and I will just pop the link in. So if you are not a member of Trauma Care, please do scan the QR code that's on your screen now to purchase a certificate for £1.99. If you are a member of Trauma Care, do not scan this QR code. Don't go near it. I will send your CPD certificates out tomorrow morning when I get into the office. If you are not a member, scan the QR code or follow the link that I've just popped into the chat and you can get your certificate. So now we have some questions. So Jean asked one very early on, and it's a very simple answer. So Jean Cragg, who is one of our lovely volunteers as well, been with us for a very long time, has asked, does the National Railway Museum at York still have an ambulance train coach? Is it still there?
Good evening, Jean. Nice to know you're there. Yes, it does. As far as I'm aware, it's no longer in a prime position. It was a short exhibition. The point about that coach was yes, it did operate in an ambulance train, but they remodeled it for exhibition purposes. but it did have a very useful history. The other coach was the one I got brought back to the Museum of Army Medicine in Kehoe in Aldershot. That sadly has been neglected for the last 25 years, and the museum is not taking it with them when they move. They've apparently found somebody to take it. I've got no idea where it's gone. It's a piece of history. It is the only surviving coach that we operated, and it's actually been designated as a piece of historic railway interest by the Science Museum. So I hope who's ever got it realizes they'd better not cut it up.
I'm sure they won't, especially if you have a word with them, Brian. So, and Kenny Lee's asked, were there many attacks by enemies on ambulance trains from any of the wars?
Yes. My current piece of research, which I'll share with you, I'm sure I'm allowed a little plug.
Yeah, of course.
I have a book coming out in a month's time in July, A History of British Army Ambulance Trains. But I was held to account by my publisher. I could only use an absolute number of words. So one little bit I left out needed a lot more research and is definitely going to be another element. And it answers your question. If I mentioned about the British Expeditionary Force in the Second War, 39, we took 9 trains out to France. And of course, they were operating as we were all withdrawing to Dunkirk. There are sadly many reports of those trains coming under direct fire, despite they were all properly declaring the Geneva Convention, which in those days was simply the Red Cross on the roofs. Our trains, you may have noticed, had Red Crosses on the sides. What you didn't notice, they were illuminated, which was the other thing. Similarly, Red Cross ships all have to be fully illuminated. But the one bit of story I want to tell you is that number 4 ambulance train got back to Dunkirk. Really difficult journey back to Dunkirk, and it was alongside on the dock at Dieppe, sorry, not at Dieppe, but as part of the Dunkirk withdrawal. And alongside was the Maid of Kent, a hospital ship, and outside of that was another hospital ship, the Brighton. An air attack came in. The first wave of aircraft flew over both the ambulance train and the 2 ships and attacked the other side of the dock. A second wave of aircraft went straight for the Maid of Kent, and one of its bombs went down the funnel, another went into the engine room. Both ships were completely burnt out, as was number 4 hospital train, because the fire spread onto the quayside and onto the quayside buildings. The star of the day was a shunter from Belgian Railways, who actually disconnected those coaches that were still serviceable, and they were pulled out and they went on to serve later on. So in answer to your question, it's a very long answer, but in answer to your question, yes, they did, sadly. And it's always been a source of concern that, do future enemies observe the Geneva Convention? Thank you.
I mean, I suppose in wartime, they probably won't, which is a really sad answer, but it is the truth. But it's just despicable to hear. But obviously, that's the sad reality of war, isn't it? That they are likely to get attacked. And Kenny's also asked, though, on almost a similar thing. Did any of these ambulance trains have an OR function, especially long distance reparation? I'm not wearing my glasses, I'm really sorry. Reparation, or were they just predominantly transports?
Yes.
That's all.
They were predominantly transport A to B. If you think about it, you can't do an awful lot traveling at 100 kph or whatever.
No.
Now, we used to have, and the Americans had, an operating theatre on their trains. But you would never use it for anything more than perhaps changing a dressing. But we had the philosophy that we'd do everything at the patient's position in the train. as we were getting close to being disbanded, I fought a very, very hard rearguard action to say that, look, there are other roles for our trains. We don't just move people from A to B. We could be used to deploy medical assets. So we could stick a couple more wagons on the back. We could take disaster relief stores. We could take a field hospital stores. So we could go and park alongside a hospital and be the ward accommodation for a hospital. So there were different roles that rail could have performed. I got people saying, "Oh, how interesting," but it didn't do anything. One of the things people describe in some of the description, indeed it was in the Dunkirk story, the number of refugees, displaced persons who are desperately trying to get on these trains as well. And that is always a problem when you're trying to do your job and you've only got limited resources.
Yeah, of course. That makes sense, actually. I didn't even think about the idea of almost stowaways trying to get on there a little bit as well, and disrupting, service as usual. And a bit of a combined question, because Kath and Ewan have asked something very similar to each other, which is, so Kath's asked, to what extent were these trains wards on trails, i.e. simply transporting injured, as opposed to places where treatments such as surgery could be delivered? But in the same vein, Ewan's asked, is there any role for surgery and operations on the trains?
Not when you're moving. No, you wouldn't do it. You take the Lifeline Express in India, that would go and park up in a siding for a week and do lots and lots of surgery. I think a future generation of trains, I believe, should be resuscitation heavy. So, the capability should be lots and lots of resuscitation capability. And of course, you can put a chest drain in, you can do all those sort of things in a moving train. If you needed to, you can do them in ambulances, so you can do them in a train. What you wouldn't be doing is opening abdomens and that sort of thing. Interestingly, we had the capability back then in, 25 years ago, I would be carrying patients who had had surgery. And the thinking at that time was you didn't move an abdomen for 5 days until then you moved it. So there was always the risk that if someone had to be moved early or something like that, that the wound could break open, it could dehiss and give all sorts of problems. So we had the capability of doing something to get closure quickly, but it would have been very, very much, wing and a prayer.
Yeah, I suppose I'm not even minor surgery. It's just basically what can you do whilst under duress and whilst moving, which when you go in, as we spoke about earlier as well, sort of when you go in at 1,000,000 miles an hour, you can't do much, can you? So no, it makes sense. And the final question for this evening, Amelia's asked, are they coming back?
Oh, if I had my way, yes. As I say, I'm waiting for my phone to ring. The important message is you cannot use rail ad hoc. It has to be planned. There has to be conversions done. And if I tell you, if you want to train in the UK, you have to say to yourself, it has to be able to go anywhere. And of course, they can't. You get on a suburban train here I live in Aldershot, you get in on a train there, it can only go where there's a third rail.
Yeah.
And so a future generation of trains need to be planned. And I believe the time is right now. This is the time it should be done. The stock exists. The stock that would be perfect for conversion is the Caledonian sleeper stock or whatever it's called this week because its ownership keeps changing. But those Mark V rolling stock, that would be wonderful. And they can go anywhere. But the important thing, I believe now, medical, military, NHS, railway industry need to sit down and plan. Because yes, we know the RAF does a fantastic job and it's got casualty care capability second to none. We know that and we understand that. But one of the reasons why Ukraine needs rail is the size of the country, but also the fact that you don't know whether you've got air superiority is the old phrase. So I hope they'll come back. My phone is waiting to ring, and I will happily help anybody who is motivated to do something. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. Again, just a fascinating look. And as I've reiterated so many times, we must look at the past to prepare for the future. And this is a great way to do that. And for anyone that's joined us tonight, you can sort of, if it's something that does come back around as well, you've now got a bit of knowledge on it. You can go away and do your own research into it and be ready for it if it is likely to happen, which is just incredibly important. You know, Scout motto is be prepared, and it's the same in all aspects of life. So before we finish off, and I'm just going to round off this evening by thanking our three wonderful sponsors. Yes, the three wonderful sponsors that we have. Of course, our first aid sponsor, QualSafe. You know them, you love them, I love them. Toby and Nigel do a fantastic job creating lots of wonderful first aid courses, as well as creating streams for us and doing all sorts of brilliant things. So thank you so much for sponsoring us. And of course, find out more about the courses they have available by scanning the QR code or going to qualsafe.org. And TCAR and PCAR, Laura, I saw you in there again tonight. It was lovely to see you joining us all the way from Oregon. Do find out more about them by scanning the QR code that's on your screen. They've got some brilliant foundational courses available, and I mean loads, too many to talk about, which means there's something definitely for you in there. We talk about trauma care, they talk about paediatric care, especially curated for nurses and AHPs as well. So do scan the QR code. Let's go to tcarprograms-uk.org to find out more. And of course, the wonderful Galen, long-standing good friends, good partners. I'm not allowed to say much about them because this is public facing and they are a pharmaceutical company. So all I can simply say is scan the QR code to find out more. And thank you very much, Galen, for being our sponsors. And that is everything from me. So for the penultimate time, wherever you are in the world, take care of yourselves, take care of your loved ones. Brian, thank you so much for joining us this evening. I hope you enjoy the rest of your night. Good night, everybody, and enjoy the rest of your evening. Good night, all.